Rain came sideways off Lake Michigan that night, hard enough to rattle the loose bolt in Gavin Reese's wiper blade, and he almost missed her taillights blinking in the dark like a small, stubborn heartbeat on the shoulder of Sheridan Road. He didn't know, as he eased his truck onto the gravel behind her stalled sedan, that the woman standing in the downpour, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, was the very woman his sister had spent 2 weeks trying to set him up with. He only knew that it was 38 degrees, that the wind was doing something ugly to the trees along the water, and that nobody should be standing outside in heels in weather like this. He was 35 years old, built like a man who worked with his hands because he did, and he had exactly one good sport coat hanging in his closet, the one he'd put on 40 minutes earlier, while his daughter sat cross-legged on his bed, narrating his every move. "You look like a funeral," Poppy had informed him, 6 years old and merciless, and he'd laughed because she wasn't wrong. He hated this. He hated blind dates, hated restaurants where the forks outnumbered the food, hated the particular flavor of dread that came from knowing a woman was going to ask him what he did for a living, and then watch her face do the polite little recalibration when he told her. He ran his own shop, Reese Restorations, out on the north side, a converted garage that had been his father's before it was his, and some months he wasn't sure it would still be his by Christmas. The bank had sent a second letter. He hadn't told his sister that part. Whitney worried enough already, ever since Danielle had walked out 2 years back and left him holding a mortgage, a business, and a little girl who still sometimes asked when Mommy was coming home. Tonight Whitney had extracted a promise from him with the tenacity of a dentist pulling a molar. "Her name is Vanessa," she'd said. "She's sharp, she's successful, and for the love of God, Gavin, wear the navy jacket, not the gray one." He hadn't asked what successful meant exactly, because he already knew he wasn't going to measure up to it, whatever it was. He was going to sit through one dinner at a restaurant called Cassia that he'd looked up online and immediately regretted agreeing to, and then he was going to come home, kiss his daughter goodnight, and never think about it again. That was the plan anyway, before he saw the taillights. 10 miles south, in a very different kind of car trouble, Vanessa Kingsley was standing in the rain trying very hard not to cry, which she considered, on principle, an unacceptable use of her evening. She was 33, and by any reasonable measure she had already won at the particular game she'd been playing since business school. She ran Kingsley Meridian, a firm that managed nearly $4 billion in commercial real estate and private equity. And she had spent that very afternoon dismantling a hostile bid from a man named Corbin Wexler with a calm surgical precision that had made her the youngest CEO in the firm's history. Wexler had sat across the boardroom table, trying to needle her about her father's legacy, about whether a woman who'd inherited her seat could really hold it, and she had answered every question so evenly that by the end of the meeting he'd stopped making eye contact with her altogether. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt, as she often did lately, entirely hollow, like a house with all the lights on and nobody home. Her car, a cream-colored '67 Mustang that had belonged to her mother, the one indulgence she allowed herself, the one thing in her life that wasn't a spreadsheet, had died with a shudder and a smell of something burning. Right there on the shoulder, with the storm coming down, like it had a grudge against her, personally. Her phone had 4% battery. Her assistant, Delphine, who had set up tonight's date with the same relentless optimism she brought to everything, was not answering. "You need something that isn't work, Vic," Delphine had told her that morning, the only person alive who still called her Vic. "A tether. A person who has no idea who you are and likes you anyway." His name was Gavin, she'd said. A mechanic, if you could believe it, which had made Vanessa laugh for the first time all week. The idea of showing up to Cassia, with its $30 appetizers and its maitre d', who could smell a bad tip from across the room, on the arm of a man who fixed cars for a living. It had felt, in the safety of her office that morning, like a small rebellion against the version of her life that Corbin Wexler and the board and her late father's ghost all seemed to expect of her. Now, standing in the rain with her heels sinking into gravel and her hollow feeling turning into something closer to panic, rebellion felt considerably less charming. That was when the headlights swung in behind her. She turned, bracing herself, the years of living in a city having taught her exactly how to hold her body, when a stranger's truck pulled up on a dark road at night, and then the door opened, and a man climbed out into the storm without hesitating, without an umbrella, moving toward her with the unhurried competence of somebody who had done this before. "You okay in there?" he called over the wind. "Excuse me," she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say, and also because something about the shape of the question, in there, like her car was a small country, and he was checking on its citizens, knocked her slightly off balance. "Your car," he said, jerking his chin toward the Mustang. "You okay? You're not hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, too fast, the way she said most things when she didn't want a stranger to see how not fine she actually was. "It just died. I don't know what happened." He was already circling toward the hood, rain running off his jaw, his one good jacket soaked through in the time it had taken him to cross the gravel. "Mind if I take a look? I promise I'm not a serial killer." "Well," he paused. "I mean, that's exactly what a serial killer would say, so you'll have to take my word for it." Despite everything, the rain, the dead phone, the ruined evening ahead of her, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "That's very reassuring. I do what I can." He popped the hood with a confidence that told her, even before he'd looked at the engine, that this wasn't a stranger playing at expertise. This was a man who'd had his hands in an engine bay 1,000 times before. "67 Mustang," he said almost to himself, running a hand along the edge of the frame with something close to reverence. "This is your mother's." She blinked. "How did you know that?" "Nobody buys one of these for themselves at your age unless they're either very rich or very sentimental, and you don't look like the kind of person who spends 200 grand on a car she'd let sit out in a storm." He glanced up at her, rain dripping off his nose. "So, sentimental. Family car." It was, in fact, exactly right, and something about being read so precisely by a total stranger left her strangely unsettled. "It was my mother's," she said. "She passed 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." He said it simply, without the practiced sympathy she's usually got from people who found out things like that, and then he turned back to the engine, because he seemed to understand, instinctively, that she didn't want to be looked at while she absorbed the small ache of having said it out loud. "Pop the hood release again for me? I want to check something. Can you actually fix it here? In this?" She gestured at the rain, the dark, the general unsuitability of the moment. "Depends what it is. Sometimes it's the fuel pump relay, sometimes it's a busted alternator belt, and sometimes it's something I can't do a thing about on the side of the road, and you're stuck waiting for a tow." He was quiet for a moment, moving a flashlight. Where had the flashlight come from? She wondered, and then remembered he'd pulled it, along with a small kit, out of the bed of his truck without her even noticing. Over the engine's guts. "You're lucky. Looks like your alternator belt slipped its housing. Give me 5 minutes. You carry tools like this around with you? In a suit?" "I keep a kit in the truck," he said. "Habit. You never know." She should have stayed in the car. That was what a sensible person did, what her security consultant would have told her to do, what 4 years of running a company that made her a target for exactly this kind of vulnerability had trained into her. Instead, she found herself walking to the passenger seat, retrieving the enormous golf umbrella she kept for emergencies, and stepping back out into the storm to hold it over him while he worked, because it seemed absurd, once she was standing there, to let a stranger get soaked to the bone fixing her car for free while she stayed dry. "You don't have to do that," he said without looking up. "I know," she said, and held the umbrella steady and didn't move. They didn't talk much while he worked. The storm made conversation difficult, and there was something oddly peaceful in the silence, in the small circle of dry ground the umbrella made over both of them, in the sound of his tools against metal. She found herself watching his hands, the sureness of them, and thinking that she couldn't remember the last time she'd watched anyone do anything with that kind of unself-competence. Everyone she worked with was performing competence, projecting it, angling for credit. He was just doing the thing. There, he said finally, straightening up, wiping his hands on a rag that had clearly seen better decades. Try her now. She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, and the engine caught on the first try, a low, healthy rumble that felt absurdly like relief. She got back out. Thank you, she said. Really, you didn't have to stop. Couldn't exactly leave you out here. He was already backing toward his own truck, rain sluicing off him, checking his watch with the particular grimace of a man who was now unforgivably late for something. You have someone waiting for you? Somewhere warm to get to? Actually, she said, and something made her hesitate, some instinct she couldn't name. I'm supposed to be at a restaurant downtown. A blind date, if you can believe it. Something flickered across his face. She'd remember it later, that half second of a man doing quick, uneasy math. But it passed and he laughed, a short, rueful sound. Small world. I'm supposed to be at a restaurant myself. Blind date. My sister's revenge for every family dinner I've skipped this year. What restaurant? She asked, mostly to be polite, already reaching for her door handle. Place called Cassia, downtown. Fancier than anywhere I've eaten in about a decade. She went very still. Cassia, she repeated. He must have heard something in her voice, because he stopped with his hand on his truck door and looked at her properly for the first time since the engine had turned over. Really looked. The way you look at someone when a piece clicks somewhere in the back of your mind and you don't yet want to believe it. Yeah, he said slowly. Why? No reason, she said too quickly, and got in her car and drove away before either of them could say anything else, her heart going in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Cassia occupied the ground floor of a converted bank building, all soft gold lighting and hushed conversation. The kind of restaurant where the silence itself seemed to cost extra. Gavin arrived 11 minutes late, his good jacket still damp at the shoulders, his hair drying into something he was fairly sure looked ridiculous, and gave the hostess a name, Vanessa, that had been rattling around in his skull since the moment the woman on Sheridan Road had said Cassia like it was a word with teeth. No, he told himself, following the hostess through the dining room. Chicago has more than one Cassia. There's probably a chain. She's probably going somewhere else entirely. He saw the cream-colored coat first, draped over the back of a chair at a corner table, and then the woman wearing it, her damp hair now pulled back, her makeup repaired with the efficiency of someone who kept a full kit in her purse for emergencies, sitting with her spine very straight and her hands folded in front of her like she was bracing for exactly this. Their eyes met. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. You, she said finally. You, he agreed, and stood there holding his own sense of the evening collapsing gently around him, because the woman he'd just spent 20 minutes kneeling in the rain for, the sentimental Mustang, the dead mother, the CEO of God only knew, what who could afford a $200,000 car and still cried a little when she talked about her mom, was Vanessa Kingsley. He knew the name. Everyone in Chicago who read a newspaper knew the name. Kingsley Meridian owned half the skyline he could see from his shop window. Whitney didn't tell me your last name, he said, sitting down slowly across from her, because there didn't seem to be anything else to do. Delphine didn't tell me yours either, she said. I don't think either of them anticipated this particular version of events. No, he agreed. I don't imagine they meet on the side of the road in a thunderstorm, and he fixes her dead mother's car, was in the plan. Something in the way he said it, dry, a little embarrassed, entirely without the calculation she was used to from men who found out what she was worth, made her laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her. It's a good story, though. It's a hell of a story, he agreed, and picked up the menu, and felt his stomach drop at the prices before he'd even finished reading the first page. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Noticing was half of what had made her good at her job. She watched him do the math behind his eyes, watched his jaw tighten slightly, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel on a blind date with a mechanic. Mortification, on his behalf, at the restaurant she herself had chosen without a second thought. The scallops are good, she offered, but honestly everything here is criminally overpriced for what it is. I believe that, he said, although I wouldn't know. since I'm still trying to figure out if the appetizer costs more than my daughter's soccer cleats. You have a daughter. Poppy. She's 6. She told me tonight I looked like I was going to a funeral. He glanced down at himself. In retrospect, she wasn't wrong, because I feel like I'm at one. Vanessa found herself smiling for the second time in 10 minutes, which was roughly her quota for an entire week lately. What does Poppy think about you going on dates? She has strong opinions. Mostly that whoever I date has to like dinosaurs, because she's currently obsessed, and if a woman can't discuss the relative merits of the Triceratops versus the Stegosaurus, Poppy considers that disqualifying. For the record, Vanessa said, Triceratops. It's not close. He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and a little startled moving behind his eyes. You just might pass the audition. They ordered. He chose the cheapest entree on the menu and pretended it was because he liked it. And she noticed that too, filed it away without comment, and the conversation kept moving in a way that surprised them both, sliding easily between easy jokes and things that mattered more. She told him, in pieces, about her father, about the company he'd built and the expectations he'd left behind along with it, about a board that watched her decisions with the particular scrutiny reserved for people the world has decided to doubt on principle. He told her, in pieces, about his father's shop, about the bank letters he hadn't told his sister about Danielle and the 2 years since, about the particular loneliness of being the only parent in a house at 7 o'clock every single night. Can I ask you something? He said, partway through the meal, and you can tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead, Wexler. He'd caught the name once, in passing when she mentioned the board meeting. He had, it turned out, an unnervingly good memory for names people mentioned in passing. Corbin Wexler. He's on your board? You know him? Not personally. But I restored a car for a man named Preston Wexler about 6 years back. His father, I think, or an uncle. Older guy, cheap as sin, tried to talk me down on parts I'd already given him a fair price on. Family had a habit of thinking everyone who worked with their hands was trying to cheat them. He shrugged. Small thing. Probably means nothing. It did not, in fact, mean nothing, though neither of them knew that yet. The Wexler family's long habit of underestimating the people who actually built things, the people who actually fixed things, was about to become considerably more relevant than either of them could have guessed over scallops that cost $41. The check came, eventually, a slim leather folder that Gavin reached for on reflex, and then stared at with an expression Vanessa would remember for a long time afterward. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a kind of tired, resigned honesty. I have $50 in my wallet, he said quietly, and this is going to be closer to $200, and I would very much like to pay for half of this dinner like a normal date, but I'm not going to be able to. And I'd rather tell you that than pretend. She reached across the table before he could say anything else and closed the folder gently. I have a better idea, Vanessa. There's a place 2 blocks from here, she said, standing, gathering her coat. That makes the best burger in this city, and it is, I promise you, less than 1/10 of what this dinner would have cost. And I have been craving it for exactly 4 years since my mother used to take me there, and I have never once had a reason to go back until right now. He looked up at her, rain-damp jacket and $50 and a bank letter he hadn't told anyone about. And something in his chest loosened, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. You're serious. Gavin Reese, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his full name, and it landed somewhere in his ribs like a small, warm stone. I run a company that manages $4 billion, and I have never once in my adult life eaten a meal I actually wanted to eat on a first date. Get your coat. The Blue Griddle sat on a corner 2 blocks north, the kind of place with a neon sign missing 1 letter and a counter worn smooth by decades of elbows, and it could not have been more different from Cassia if it had been built on a different planet. They took a booth by the window, rain still coming down outside, and ordered burgers and milkshakes like teenagers, and somewhere between the first bite and the last fry, something settled between them that neither of them had words for yet, except that it felt like relief, like a held breath finally released. This is the best date I've been on in 6 years, Gavin said, halfway through his burger, and meant it so plainly that she believed him instantly. Mine too, Vanessa said. And I once had a man propose to me on our third date because his financial advisor told him it would be a good merger. He nearly choked on his fries. Did that actually happen? Unfortunately, yes. I said no. He seemed more disappointed about the quarterly projections than about me, which told me everything I needed to know. They talked until the diner started stacking chairs around them, until the rain outside slowed to a drizzle, and the streetlights turned the wet asphalt gold. And when he walked her back to her car, running fine now, purring like nothing had ever been wrong with it, she found herself reluctant, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to say goodnight. I want to see you again, he said, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who half expected to be told no. I know this isn't the kind of thing you're used to, fancy restaurants or any of it. I've got a 6-year-old and a shop that might not make it past Christmas and a truck older than some of your board members. Probably. Gavin. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see, even in the dim streetlight, that she meant what she was about to say. I have spent the last 4 years being told what I should want by men who have never once fixed anything with their own hands, who have never once stood in the rain for someone who wasn't going to be useful to them. I don't want fancy. I want. She stopped, searching for the word, and found it. I want this. Whatever this was, tonight. I want more of it. He kissed her then, careful and a little disbelieving, like a man who wasn't sure he was allowed, and she kissed him back like a woman who had decided, somewhere between the burger and the milkshake, that she was done letting other people decide what she deserved. The weeks that followed were not, of course, a fairy tale in any uncomplicated sense. Nothing that involved a struggling business and a 6-year-old's trust and a board of directors ever quite was. Poppy took 2 full visits to warm up to Vanessa and then declared, with the sudden total loyalty of small children, that Vanessa was basically the best, largely on the strength of an argument about triceratops that Vanessa had, tactically, allowed her to win. Whitney cried actual tears the first time she found out who her brother's blind date had turned out to be, half from shock and half from the giddy vindication of having been right about something for once. The bank letter, when Gavin finally showed it to Vanessa, not asking for anything, just being honest, because he'd decided somewhere in that diner that honesty was the only thing he had left to offer, did not disappear because a billionaire's daughter waved a checkbook at it, because that was not, in the end, what either of them wanted. Instead, 3 weeks later, Vanessa sat across a different table, her own boardroom, this time, Corbin Wexler watching with poorly disguised curiosity, and proposed that Kingsley Meridian's new commercial development on the north side use exactly one restoration contractor for all of its vintage architectural ironwork and custom fittings. Reese Restorations. It's a legitimate business decision, she told Wexler when he raised an eyebrow. His work is exceptional, his rates are fair, and frankly, Corbin, I'd rather give the contract to a man who actually knows what he's doing with his hands than another firm that outsources everything and marks it up 300%. If you have a problem with the decision, I'm happy to walk you through the comparative bids. He did not, in the end, have a problem with the decision, mostly because he didn't have the numbers to argue with it. And Gavin signed the contract 2 weeks later at a kitchen table, with Poppy sitting on his lap, insisting on helping, her small hand guiding his on the pen in a scrawl that would later live framed above the register at the shop. It wasn't a rescue, not really. That was a word Vanessa was careful never to use, and Gavin was grateful for it, because the last thing either of them wanted was a story where one of them had saved the other. It was closer to what they'd found on the side of Sheridan Road in the rain. 2 people who had stopped, without being asked to, and stayed exactly as long as it took to fix what was broken, and then a little longer than that, just to see what happened next. 6 months later, on a night with no rain at all, Gavin parked his truck, new enough, purchased outright the month the Kingsley Meridian contract cleared. Outside the Blue Griddle, where Poppy was waiting inside with Vanessa, the two of them deep in an argument about whether pterodactyls counted as dinosaurs, which they did not, a fact Vanessa had apparently researched extensively enough to win Poppy's grudging respect. He stood outside the window for a second longer than he needed to, watching them through the glass, his daughter laughing at something the CEO of a $4 billion company had just said, and thought that if you had yelled, told him, on that stalled, storm-soaked stretch of road, that this was where the night was headed, he would not have believed a word of it. He went inside anyway. He'd learned by then not to argue with good things when they found him.